Hi, these are the texts for my Sunday school class for this coming Sunday, February the 23rd. And these are the texts that we're going to be using in worship on March the 22nd, the fourth Sunday of Lent. I'm going to touch base on all four texts, but I will remind you that our focal point for the month of March is going to be the Psalms. And so we're going to spend most of our time on the Psalms today. And the Psalm in question for this coming Sunday in Sunday school and for March the 22nd is probably the most familiar Psalm to virtually everyone, and that is Psalm 23. And I hesitated just so you could run it through your mind because I am almost 100% positive that you and I would have come up and did come up with it, in fact, the very same Psalm. So I'm going to touch on the other texts first. I'm not going to read them all, but I will tell you a little bit about them. I'm going to save the Ephesians text to give it a slight comparison to the 1 Samuel text, and I think you'll see why. And then we'll spend our time on the Psalm instead. The text, the gospel lesson for this coming Sunday in Sunday school is in John's Gospel, the 9th chapter, and it's a very, very long one because it's one whole story. You know, most of the stories in the gospel accounts are pretty short. We call them pericopes, and in a pericope there's a location, the actors, the action, and often a reaction. And so those things often take place in very short little snippets. And I suppose you could divide this one up. But the guts of this is Jesus' encounter with religious leaders and a blind man, and everything that falls out, I guess you could say, in pericope form, as a reaction to what occurs. It begins like this. Jesus encounters this blind man on the side of the road who has been blind from birth. And his disciples ask him, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Now, keep in mind that in that day and time with our Hebrew friends, that there was the assumption that God punished those who had sinned and rewarded those who were without sin or who hadn't sinned. And so to see somebody who was blind or lame made it kind of easy to write them off as they must have done something really egregious, or maybe it was their parents or grandparents who really did something so bad that God was continuing to punish. Which makes Jesus' overall attention to people who are poor, to people who are ailing in some way, even more powerful and even more disruptive to the culture and to the religion that they understood. So the disciples are the ones asking, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus says a profound thing, neither. But he was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. And so then Jesus heals this blind man, but he doesn't do it in the way we've seen with others. He spits on the ground, makes a little bit of mud, rubs it in the man's eyes, and tells him to go to the pool of Siloam, which was a pool inside the city of Jerusalem. So when he goes in there, there are people drawing water and people doing whatever else they would do beside the pool of Siloam. And when he washes and he begins to see, the people that recognize him realize that something amazing has occurred, and that's when the trouble starts. First of all, religious leaders begin to wonder, how can this guy Jesus, who obviously is a sinner, heal somebody? Because only someone who is without sin could possibly heal, which certainly means they've never known anybody who could heal somebody else. But that's not what they say. Then after pressing this, they drag the man in and who's been healed. And the essence of that part of the story is some of them decide, well, this really can't be the guy. He just looks like the guy who was healed. That leaves them all restless, and so they drag in this grown man's parents. And their response is, in a great deal of fear, well, he's of age, just ask him what happened. And so at the end of the story, the man who has had his sight restored but hasn't seen Jesus yet encounters Jesus, and at the end he believes. So that's how the story works out. The man himself has been put in jeopardy by religious leaders who, would like to get rid of this break to their culture and to their religion. His parents were put in jeopardy and made it easy not to defend their son, but just to say, well, he's a grown man, just ask him. But the grown man who was blind and now who is able to see is the one that stands and who says, all I know is I once was blind, now I see. And then when he encounters Jesus, he says, I believe. Powerful story, but it also lets us know that just because Jesus is involved in a human life does not mean that that life is without danger, without trials and stresses. It also means something that's even more hopeful. If the man was born blind so that God might show his power through him, that begs the question for us that in our weaknesses, how might God be showing God's power in us and through us? A very powerful thing that we're left to ponder with no answer here, just to ponder and be open in our times of greatest distress, how God may be using that to show God's own power. The Ephesians text is very short. It's Ephesians 8 through 14 in chapter 5. And I have found one verse in there that I want to put up next to the text from 1 Samuel. And it's where Paul says, take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. The unfruitful works of darkness. And then he talks about everything is exposed by the light and so forth, and that Christ is the light and Christ will shine on you. All that's wonderful. But this sense of unfruitful works of darkness, what constitutes an unfruitful work of darkness? Now, you and I can think of plenty of things. Robbing a bank would certainly be one of those, harming another human being, and so all of those, what we might call dirty deeds. But are there other unfruitful works of darkness? And so what I want to offer to you here is in 1 Samuel, and see if you don't think, I don't think it actually is an unfruitful work of darkness. I think it's clever and savvy. But see what you think, because it certainly isn't straightforward. Let's just put it like that. The context in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verses 1 through 13, is that Samuel, who is a judge in Israel, the judge of Israel, a prophet in Israel, and a priest to the king, and the king has been Saul, the first king, not David just yet. God has rejected Saul for disobedience. And now Samuel is moping. Samuel is the one that anointed Saul. And so now Samuel is moping around because God has rejected Saul as king. And the first thing out of the mouth of the Lord is, how long are you going to grieve over Saul? Saul is still alive. Saul is still, in effect, the king. But he has been rejected, which puts Israel in a difficult place and puts Samuel, to use a phrase from Psalm 23, puts Samuel in the shadow of the valley of death, because he knows it's time to move on but cannot figure out the way. And so he's upset over an action he took in behalf of the people that now has been rejected by God. The word of the Lord comes to him and he says, Fill your horn with oil. Anointing was a way of signaling someone set aside for a special purpose. And I'm going to send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided myself a king from among his own sons. And so here's the best part in this whole story to me. Well, there are two great parts, but this to me is the very best. Samuel says, well, how can I go? Because if Saul hears that I'm going to do this, he's going to kill me. So God says, take a heifer with you and just tell everybody along the way, I am going to Jesse and invite Jesse to worship with me as we sacrifice this cow. Now, to me, that doesn't sound very straightforward or honest. I guess all of our motives for worship can be mixed. I'll be interested to know what you think about this. It may be that this is just being very savvy and shrewd, but it provides a good challenge for us in terms of how we're honest. I think something I'm going to mention near the very end from John Calvin may be helpful and insightful. It doesn't give us a direct answer to this, but it may be helpful and insightful. And so Samuel goes and they have worship, and he invites the sons, and Jesse pulls his 7 oldest boys, and the first one looks like he ought to be a king. He looks like the part, right out of a movie. You always pick the tall, physically handsome people to be kings in movies, or most of the time anyway. But God says he's not the one. And so they work through the 7, and none of them are the ones that Samuel feels as though God is inspiring him to anoint. And so he asks Jesse, you got another kid? And Jesse says, well, I've got the little one out in the field. He's watching the sheep. And so that's the one they bring in, and that's David, and that's who gets to be anointed. So the fact that the one that Samuel thinks should be the one is not the one, and the one that even his own daddy doesn't think should be the one winds up being the one who is anointed to be king. Good lesson about the call of God, and this is the kind of thing that's repeated throughout the Old Testament, where in an age of primogeniture, which means the age where the oldest boy was always the one that was expected to do the best and to manage everything and to be the true leader, where primogeniture in the way the Bible works out almost never occurs. Jacob was the secondborn, and yet Jacob is the one through whom God made the promise. We can say, as we've discussed before with Abraham and Sarah, because Ishmael was legally Sarah's firstborn, and we've talked about that. And if you're watching one of these videos for the first time, come on to Sunday school, and I'll fill you in on why it is that Ishmael is technically, legally, the firstborn of Abraham. Cain and Abel. Cain was the firstborn, but his offering did not find favor with God. It was the secondborn. Joseph and all of his brothers. Joseph was the youngest originally before Benjamin was born, and Joseph was the one who became the leader that rescued all of his brothers and all of their families from starvation. So this is a pretty standard biblical approach throughout all the texts. But to me, the biggest piece that reminds me of Psalm 23 is that section to where Samuel knows if he goes, he's going to get killed. And so the word of the Lord whispered in his ear says, well, go worship. Go tell everybody you're going to worship. Take a heifer and do the sacrifice. And then we'll pick from among the boys for the king. I'm going to read Psalm 23 now. And I'm going to read it through from the New English Version, which is no longer the New English Version. It was partially formed by the Church of Scotland. There's actually a newer one than that, which I don't have possession of. But the reason I've always liked the New English, I like the way it manages the Hebrew poetry. So it'll be a little different. And a lot of the words that are used in here are also the words in the New Revised Standard and in the Revised Standard. And I'm going to make a correction or two to how some of the words are translated, but we're going to, and you'll see what I'm doing here momentarily. Let's see here. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall want nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures and leads me beside the waters of peace. He renews life within me, and for his name's sake guides me in the right path. Even though I walk through a valley dark as death, I fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy staff and thy crook are my comfort. Thou spreadest a table for me in the sight of my enemies. Thou hast richly bathed my head with oil, and my cup runs over. Goodness and love unfailing, these will follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long. Well, there are several elements in this psalm that I'd like for us to spend a little bit of time with. First of all, it's worth noting that this is an exposition after the first line on the metaphor of the first line, which is, the Lord is my shepherd. This notion of shepherd has a very rich history, both theologically and politically, for the children of Israel. You can go to a concordance and look up probably close to a dozen places, certainly more than half a dozen, to where either God is referred to as shepherd, or a leader like a king is referred to as shepherd of God's people, and the people are referred to as a flock. But it isn't always the pastoral imagery of being out on the hill. It is this image of the person who protects, who makes the weighty decisions in order to help the flock to thrive. And so the kings of Israel are often called shepherds as well. And it becomes an image of a political type in that way. So it begins with the notion of shepherd, and so it begins to spread out from there. The very next phrase, which is, I shall not want, the word want is probably not the best translation. I think the best translation, instead of shall not want, is I lack, or I will lack nothing. And there's a whole difference, isn't there, in wanting and in lacking. Shall not want means that, I have no desires for other things. Shall not lack means quite plainly what the sense of the text is that nothing that I need will be lacking for me. It also brings to mind the children of Israel in the wilderness during their 40-year wandering, where they often complained, and I'm sure that a group of people on the march for all that time would find that certain things are in very scarce supply. So it brings in a different notion of what it means to lack or not to lack what is necessary. And so it helps us to even strip away from ourselves the things that we may think are necessary in life that really are not. That somehow by faith we can trust that God continues to provide as a shepherd. And let's face it, everywhere a shepherd can lead the shepherd's sheep in any part of the world, the pastures aren't always the best. The climate is not always the best, and yet it is the shepherd's role that to remain bent on making certain that the sheep survive, and wherever and whenever possible, that the sheep thrive. So lack nothing is a faith statement that there will always be there for me the thing provided by the shepherd that sustains me. The whole rest of the psalm is all about this notion of completing that sentence about I shall lack nothing. Paths of righteousness, or the right paths, again suggests that in our pilgrimage of life, things may not go as we would like them to go. Whether it's how we've been employed, hired, fired, skipped over, whatever the situation may be, caught up in a economic depression or whatever, but somehow, even in the middle of all the different things that can go on in life, that we are led in the right paths. And we can trust that. Again, it's another faith statement. Think about that blind man in our text today. His life was actually easier in certain ways, certainly not under the threat of death, until he gained his sight. We might say he was in the right path while he was blind, because that put him in a position for Jesus to do something amazing that stirred the culture and stirred the religion in a way that God had always planned along the right path. And yet at the same time, now that he's gained his sight and can rejoice and can appreciate his sight in a way that those of us who are born with normal eyesight may not fully be able to appreciate because we take it for granted, here he is now with sight. It seems like such a wonderful thing, and it is. But now, since he is providing testimony to someone outside the religious circle, and it does put his life in jeopardy. We certainly see that from his parents' own fear. So the right path does not mean necessarily the path to glory or the path to comfort and ease. Thy rod and thy staff, that goes back both to a shepherd image of, we say rod, probably really means scepter or mace, a thing that indicates royalty. Staff is that one. Staff and rod are the same. The crook, shepherd's crook, obviously is for the shepherd in the field. And so we have both of those images wrapped up in thy rod and thy staff at the same time. Our psalmist is really holding these political images, these theological images, with the pastoral image. He's pulling them all together, even though he's giving us hints that it doesn't mean some wonderful place all the time in the way that you and I think of wonderful, but they are wonderful in the sense that God has created them and that we are elements of God's beauty as his flock as we move through the life that we have been given. Maybe my favorite statement in all of Psalm 23 is, you prepare a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. This is actually, again, just like rod and staff, and I haven't looked at this from a Hebraic poetry sense to see if our poet has actually put rod and staff on one line and then the table and enemies on another to show us that it also is kind of a couplet all of its own right, because it means two things. And remember, so much Hebrew poetry are in these couplets. Table before me in the presence of mine enemies actually means two things. The feast that the imagery here is of a feast of thanksgiving, where good things have happened, as the text has built up for us. Good things that have happened, the right paths, lacking nothing, you're always with me, rod and staff protect me. So this table before me begins as an image of the feast of Thanksgiving, where we actually celebrate and invite friends in to say, isn't it wonderful what's happening? So there's that image, which is more of a political image. or excuse me, more of a religious image. And in the presence of my enemies, we could call that a political image, but it also ties in the image of the shepherd in the field, because there's an old Hebrew phrase about spreading the table, which meant that when a shepherd discovered a new field, before he would allow his sheep to enter the field, the shepherd himself would enter that area and clear it of things that were dangerous. He would look for vipers, for poisonous snakes. He would look to see if there were any dens that might hold a wolf or a lion. And were those things the case, he would take pains to kill those or drive them out before allowing his sheep to come in. So we have this wonderful image, thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies, which links together the theology, the politics, and the image of a shepherd in the field. I hope that you're appreciating how this simple, short little poem is just so elegant in all of its meaning, which great poems always are, aren't they? Is so potent in their meaning. Then lastly, this affirmation of faith again, surely goodness and mercy shall follow me. I want to take on two elements here that are translated that way, and I don't like either of them. Goodness and mercy is in itself fine, but the word for mercy here is chesed, almost a sound, chesed. It really means steadfast love or loving kindness, or both all mixed together. This kind of undying, unconditional affection of the shepherd for the flock, affection of the king for the people, affection of God for God's own children. All of those are wrapped up in that word chesed. So it really probably ought to read something like, the New English says love unfailing. That's good. Steadfast love is the typical way of saying that. But so surely goodness and steadfast love, or surely goodness and love unfailing. These will, it says, follow me. There's a better word here, and I think it's probably a stronger interpretation. The better word would be, this shall pursue me all the days of my life. Follow is a little more passive. Pursuit sort of fits with steadfast love, or love undying, or love unfailing from God, that it is persistent, that it will not end, that it is always hunting us down. There's a poem, what is it, The Hound of Heaven, which speaks about how God is always in pursuit. And I have no doubt that's what is truly intended in this poem, is this continual pursuit on the part of God for his people. And let's face it, we don't always have a sense of God's love. But what a great faith statement it is when we can't feel love, to have the confidence that God is continuing to pursue us to those moments in life where we recognize that we're embraced in God's loving arms. I think John Calvin sums up this element best, and I think it's in Book 1 of Calvin's Institutes, and he says there's a great difference between the sleep of stupidity, his word, not mine. There's a great difference in the sleep of stupidity and the repose that faith produces. In other words, our faith is not naive. We don't look at the world through rose-colored glasses. Bad things happen. We all know that. The psalm does not suppose that bad things do not happen. Valley of death, In the presence of mine enemies, it's acknowledged right there in the text. But the final faith affirmation is that even when we do not experience it, we know that the love of God continues in its pursuit of us. Well, that ends our lesson. I look forward to seeing what you have to say on Sunday. I hope I've opened up the Psalm text a little bit, and I'll be interested to see how you may be able to tie it together with Samuel's own story about sneaking around in worship, with Paul's own text about the light of Christ, and of course with that wonderful text which I think most potently reflects the psalm, the story of the blind man in the Gospel of John. As always, if you think about it, invite somebody to come to our Sunday school class. I'll look forward to seeing you this coming Sunday over in the seminary building. Thanks for joining in.